Hello and welcome to this InflectraCON 2023 virtual bonus session. InflectraCON will be held from April 19th through the 21st in Washington, D.C. on the campus of Gallaudet University. We are looking forward to 3 days of customer training, partner meetings, industry sessions, networking, and more. Check us out at www.inflectracon.com. This session is led by Sana Visser, Test Consultant at Capgemini. Let's get started with her virtual bonus session entitled 7 Ways to Collaboratively Assess Product Risk.
Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this bonus session for InflectraCON 2023. My name is Sana Visser and I'll introduce myself a little bit better further on. And today you are here to listen to me natter on about 7 ways to collaboratively assess product risk. So, funny story, the first time I ever did this presentation, I actually misspelled the word assess, messed up and left out the most embarrassing S you could possibly forget about. So I've very scrupulously checked this version so that it doesn't say 7 ways to assess product risk, but assess. Help me out and keep a good eye out in case I missed one and I still have a typo in there somewhere because it was quite embarrassing at the time. So hopefully you'll be spared that little bit. So today's agenda is going to be about assessing product risk. Why do you even need to do that? We're going to discuss 7 ways to assess product risk. We're going to talk about when they are useful virtually, when they are useful face-to-face, which ones are maybe interesting to use when you have a lot of stakeholders you need to get to. And then we're going to talk about some action items. Yes, I will expect you to do a few things as well, but hopefully they'll be helpful to you. So here we go. Like I said, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Sana Visser. You can follow me and at Simply Sana on almost all the socials. That includes Mastodon. I am part of the Women in Testing community. I run a webcast that I do monthly. You can check out my YouTube channel there, 9 out of 10 testers. I do with a bunch of friends. I work at Capgemini. I organize, again, with some good testing friends of good software. And I am an avid reader. I love to read, and that includes reading about how to do risk assessments. I know it might not keep you up at night, but I have consumed quite a bit of reading material about this so far. So just a little bit about my employer, because this is the obligatory slide that allows me to come and speak to you here today. I love working here. In the picture there, you see this community that I'm a part of, the Agile Testers. I love working there, and the really cool thing about them, of course, is that they pay me and allow me to develop and create talks like this for folks like you. So thank you for that. So let's begin. Are you ready? Are you ready to know what these 7 types of risk assessments are? Here we go. Here's all of them. Product risk assessment, very classically, frequency times impact, risk storming, stack ranking, the nightmare headline game, threat modeling, risk poker, and would you risk it? I'm going to talk about these 7. But like I said, I'm going to get you to do a little bit of work as well. So right now, grab a pen, grab a piece of paper, or maybe you do this in Excel, I don't really mind. Pick any way you want to write this down and just number quickly 1 through 7 and make these 2 columns. I know this and I've used it and I liked it. And then go through for yourself the classical product risk assessment, some type of frequency of use or frequency of feature times the impact or the chance that things might go wrong. That's a very classical one. Maybe you've done risk storming, maybe you've ever been in a workshop of theirs, or you have actually used this tool. Stack ranking. Of course, I'm hoping you don't know what that is because that is my surprise. Nightmare headline game, threat modeling, risk poker, and would you risk it? So as I go and continue these next few slides, make this little graph for yourself. Do you know it? And when you used it, did you like it? Because I'm interested to know. So let's start with the basics. Why do a product risk assessment? Well, generally, as we are approaching any kind of testing in any kind of environment, we want to do some kind of ranking. And that ranking is to determine what to test best, to create a shared understanding of risk, and also to create a plan to deal with said risk. A very frequently heard phrase here is no risk, no test. In general, the idea is that what is riskier, more likely to fail, or more likely to have a big impact on the business, those are the things you should test most, test best, and also test first, as generally, in terms of planning, we tend to run out of time, and one of the first things to be sacrificed is still very frequently test time. So here's an important thing to know. Testing is a risk reduction response. Now, as you do your product risk assessments, it's very important to realize that you have more than just testing as a tool to combat risk. So the thing to think about here would be, as you are creating your product risk assessment and you're discussing a plan to mitigate these, don't forget about the other options. Testing is just a risk mitigation or a risk reduction tactic. Can you maybe avoid the risk? Sometimes it is possible to choose another path, to design in a different way, or to even avoid building a certain feature altogether. It's a very valid option and one that can definitely be considered, especially in early stages of a project. Then you have the ability to transfer risk. Now, this is typically done, I find, by going and finding partners to work with. So there might be a certain risk that there is a security threat. In that case, you would go and find a partner that would be responsible for designing security into your systems. In that case, they would carry the risk of securing that application. So you would transfer risk in that case, and then you and your team don't need to do that activity. Wouldn't recommend it, especially if you're working DevOps. Security tends to have to be baked in. You have to do continuous security as well. But there are options when you can delegate a risk to another party. You can choose another tool that will transfer the risk of failure or transfer the impact of failure to another party, and then you can transfer it. And the last but not least is to accept a risk. Generally, this is where you're up against the wall, you're about to go live, and there is no more time or options. This is typically when testers will ask business or some stakeholder to accept a certain level of risk. There's a thing that we haven't been able to fix, but we know there is a fault or we have a workaround in place, and then we ask people to accept risk. Now, in terms of risk response options, there is a difference in retention of business value. So the highest retention of business value is if you can avoid it, then if you can reduce it, then if you can transfer it, and then if you can accept it. So there is a ranking here as well in terms of best risk response options. And as you can see, risk mitigation as the second best is still a very good response to risk, which is why testing is so often correspondingly talking about what kind of risk are we mitigating? So here we go. Number one, risk assessment strategy. Product risk assessment. This is usually some variation of the likelihood of a failure or a problem occurring times the impact that it would have on the value chain for your business. So generally, it will be mapped in a matrix structure. It will be the one value multiplied by the other. Where you do tend to get a lot of variance is where which factors you allow to come into either likelihood or impact and how you measure them. They can also be different scales, and you can also have some weighting in there. There's a lot of variations in this. When is the best moment to use a product risk assessment? In my experience, I like to use them when we are in early stages of projects. I like them in the kickoff phases. It can be quite time consuming. It requires at least 3 hours to do the risk assessment. I wouldn't recommend doing this one virtually because it does generally mean getting a group of people, 10 to 15 people in a room to discuss why they think certain scores are justified. So what you'll do is you'll gather stakeholders together after you've already agreed on test topics. I'll make a note about that later. You'll rank the topics on likelihood, and then you'll rank the topics on impact. Then, and this is the important part, because this is where you get consensus, you're going to gather the scores and you're going to discuss each score and agree on that ranking. So what you'll get is that, for instance, Abdil will say, I think the likelihood of this causing a failure is off the charts. I think it's like 25. This is sure to go wrong because we don't know how this tech works. We've never seen it before. And then somebody else on the team will say, well, I would rank it an 11. So say that would be Sarah. Sarah would be like, that's an 11. I've seen this before. We've worked with it. We're quite sure we can mitigate some of those risks by maybe slotting in a slightly different tool here. I'm scoring this 11. So then you, as a facilitator in the product risk assessment, will ask Abdil and Sarah to both discuss together what the end ranking would be for that ticket, especially when their scores are far apart. One of the dangers of this method is that you'll get a whole bunch of bundling, like collective, everything is pretty much important, and a whole gathering in the middle. And in that case, you want to try and use your facilitation skills to tease those apart a bit. Not everything can be equally important. You do want to get quite a spread out ranking as an end result. If all of your results are clustered around that middle bullet there, likely you don't have enough information or you haven't got the right people on board, because then everything is equally important and needs to be tested equally as much, and that's not the most useful of results. Again, it can be a useful bit of information, but it means you need to do some more digging into product risk. Number two is possibly a familiar one to some people. At least here I've seen it quite a few times. It's called risk storming. Now, risk storming is relatively new, but like I said, it's been around for a while. And one of the things I really like about this one is it's a little bit more versatile. So it allows for both virtual and in-person risk assessments. It uses these beautiful packs of cards called test sphere cards that have different categories. Quality attributes is one of those, risk avoidance options is another, or add a test technique. And this methodology is beautifully described on their own website as well. So you can have a session that typically does take the same amount of time as a product risk assessment, but it's very collaborative. And it is, with the cards, it feels quite gamified as well. So you bring a group together, usually between 3 and 15 people, and then you follow these same steps, except that you decide on the quality attributes as a group. So that's not done pre-session, that's done in session. And then you brainstorm risk avoidance options using the other cards. This is, again, very structured approach. I like it, though, because it does allow for some larger planning sessions to have an activity that involves that. So it can be done in product increment plannings or at a kickoff of a project, or when you're starting a larger feature. So it's very useful there. The virtual version of this is beautiful. It's very easy to use as well. It has all the cards there digitally, and it's well worth taking a look at. So here's number 3, 7 ways to assess product risk. And number 3 will surprise you. Now, are you ready? Here we go. It's stack ranking. Honestly, I feel this is the most simple one, but some of the most overlooked. I think in terms of simplicity, it has all the strengths. All this is, stack ranking, is the name for the sorting of a list. So you would very simply take your test items again and rank them in order of importance. So you give everybody a list of item 1 through 10, for instance, and then you let everybody respond from their own knowledge and experience to a ranking. So if, for instance, again, Sarah does think that item 2 needs to move down because it's not as risky as, for instance, Abdil thinks, she'll drag that item down and she'll rearrange the order of that list. Here's where this one really gets interesting, because it is easy to see and do, and you have this option in a lot of surveying tools. It generally does allow for an assessment of very, very large groups of people, and it allows you to do that risk assessment asynchronously if you have to. I will always recommend when doing risk assessments to be as collaborative as possible and try and get people into the same space or virtual room. But if you can't, if you have restrictions that make that really hard to do, to get all the people that you need to think about the risk of your project, then this is an excellent thing to do, because you can create a survey and you can send it out and get everybody's responses back in. Again, there's a risk here of getting a lot of consensus and getting every item ranked equally important, and it doesn't allow for much distinction between items. So there's no real subjective idea of why the item at the top of your list has more risk than the item at the bottom. But it is a way to very quickly gather a lot of feedback about the product that you're assessing. And generally, it's very short on time, especially if you do it asynchronously. It's just the couple of minutes people need to fill out the form. One of the dangers of this one is because it is then asynchronous, explaining what each test item is and what they're actually ranking is one of the areas where it might be a bit tough to get the right information across. You can and will get people that don't read any of the accompanying information and just rank the items. So take things with a little bit of a grain of salt. So that was stack ranking. Now you know. All right, number 4. This is the nightmare headline game. This I discovered first in the book Explore It by Elizabeth Hendrickson, and it's a technique that allows you to especially think about the impact side of risk assessment, because it's very much a game of imagination. So again, this is a nice one to do at the beginning of projects or at the beginning of large features or sprints. It takes less time because it's more focused towards impact, and it's a way to help teams and projects think about risk in the sense of what might go wrong. This method is that you gather stakeholders together and you have them each imagine nightmarish headlines about the system under test. And then you follow that up by a brainstorm on how to reduce risk. So this is for group sizes between 5 and 10 people, generally key players in a project. And it takes less time. It's usually just about 1 or 2 hours. It can be very well part of a kickoff day. And the one thing to note about this one is, more than in the others, you will tend to get a mixture of project risk and of product risk. So when you have both mixed in, so a project risk would be anything that runs the risk of budgets run over or something in those lines. And then those are not necessarily something that goes wrong in your product. So those will tend to get mixed in together with this method. It's not a bad thing. It just means you need to be very aware when you do start sorting them. You're not going to mitigate most project risks with better testing. Those will have to be product risks. So just make sure to separate those at the end of the session. All right, number 5, threat modeling. So threat modeling is very much become a best practice, and it's good to see that it's being used more and more. It's this similar thing to a product risk assessment, but it's used for assessing security risk. It uses the STRIDE model for identifying risk, and the STRIDE model is to set the objectives. Right, so a little hiccup there. Threat modeling is a product risk assessment that is used particularly for finding and mitigating security threats, or security risks, as you may call them. The way it's typically done, and again, it's very much face-to-face. It can be done virtually, but it gathers stakeholders together and has them identify threats based on a model of the application. And then it has a second half wherein we think about what to do to mitigate those threats. So this frequently uses the STRIDE model to identify those threats. So STRIDE model, just in case someone's not familiar, is about preventing ways to do that you're vulnerable to spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denials of service, or elevation of privilege. So this is something to be used very frequently. I would suggest that this is done periodically throughout the project or the life cycle of a product. Certainly within certain structures, I would do it every increment planning, by which I mean roughly every quarter. It does take between 3 to 4 hours. It can be done virtually. The main thing I really like about the threat modeling process is actually the step number 2, where collectively there is a visual picture drawn of the application that is being built. Now, this visual model, I find this step builds a lot of consensus within the projects that I've worked on. That means we all understand what it is that we are as a product going to be building. That was a beautiful sentence. So it helps us to visualize what are we building. And it also really connects people quite deeply in terms of helping them understand how all the different components and parts are going to be working together. So even for people who are coming from a business background, who are coming from an agile background like Scrum Masters, they get the opportunity to understand how all the components work together, but also where that application that we are building has connections to the outside world. So where possibilities occur that we are vulnerable. And that's one of the reasons I really like this process. I haven't actually run this workshop ever, but I've been a part of several threat modeling sessions, and I'm a big fan. All right, number 6. We're nearing the end here. Second to last. Risk poker. Now, I hope that almost all of you, at the very least, put this in the column of I know this and I have used this. Now, I'm not talking about story point estimation here. I'm talking about risk poker. It's not the same as estimating time, estimating effort on a story, not time. So it's not an effort estimate. It's not a time estimate either. I should fix that here. It's about risk. And the way that you do it is like you poker for anything. You can do this very frequently. It takes very little time. I put 1 to 2 hours because I feel it's generally going to be part of some type of refinement session, and those typically do take 1 to 2 hours. But you could theoretically poker every story or every ticket or every increment. It does, I think, do better when it's slightly more on a feature level or an epic level. It's the same as planning poker, but for risk. So you talk about likelihood and impact for each individual story that you are going to take into your sprint. And then as a group, as a team, you do the poker. And again, the consensus reaching part of this is where it truly shines. Having that discussion between differences in the cards that people put up. Why did you poker this a 5? Why are you poking this an 8? What's the difference there in understanding of risk for that story? And then discussing in that same session the possible tests to add to the story or adjusting some of those acceptance criteria based on the risk poker results. It can also influence, or at least I feel it should influence ranking of the sprint backlog, whereby that you take a look that you put the most test effort and maybe do first what has come out as highly risky in terms of what the team feels about the ticket. So this one should be relatively easy to do. There's a ton of tools virtually to poker anything. Teams tend to be really familiar with this one, which is why it makes it very easy one to implement, because you tend to be doing effort estimations anyway. And it's the Fibonacci sequence, of course. So we know this, we use it in a lot of other aspects of agile working. Adding risk poker should then be relatively quick for teams to pick up. And I highly, highly recommend making this a standard practice of any iteration or sprint that you do. Right, nearing the end here, the last one, number 7. Would you risk it? So This is not necessarily a product risk assessment, but I felt it needed a mention here because these cards that were developed by Lena, Lena Weiberg, she has cards for better thinking. So these heuristic on these cards are about common heuristics to consider when you're brainstorming testing options. Everything else I've talked about so far is more about the consensus building, the mitigation planning. This is very specifically about brainstorming, software testing, test items. So this is the creating the list, basically. It's a card game that helps you brainstorm better. There's all sorts of way to use it. It's very much also up to teams how they want to use it. It is not available virtually yet, but it's on its way. I highly recommend this one because it is visually also beautiful. The cards are gorgeous, and they do help the team brainstorm better. You can also use the test sphere cards for this very same purpose. That's very useful. You take the blue version of the test sphere cards, but I like the would you risk it because it goes further into tools and traps and weapons for software testing, as they say themselves. So each of the cards is aimed at either a tool, a trap, or a weapon. And because they are high level kind of heuristics to think about what might be a risk for your application for the product that you're building, it really brings the team along in terms of getting started on creating an understanding. Where do we look? How do we even think about what things to test, what things to rank, and which might be riskier than others? So obviously not every card is going to be applicable. That's not the point. The point is to come to a list of between 3 and 10 items to rank. And that's what this card game is particularly useful for. So I've added it here. You can order these cards through the Ministry of Testing, or you can buy Lena's book, all of which are linked at the end of this presentation. Right, great. So what about online versus offline? Like, I know I mentioned it quite a few times, but I thought I'd create a beautiful graph for you so that you can see what I mean by best used online, best used face-to-face, and also which ones are more collaborative than others. Now, all of these are collaborative, so there is no single method on the other side of this axis. But when it comes to most collaborative and the best use online, I would have to say it is risk storming. The online version of this is so good. It's so useful. It really does not do any less than the physical version of this, and I highly recommend it to everybody. Next, in terms of best use online, I think would be stack ranking due to the ease of use. Again, do beware of this one. The value of that ranking is lower, I feel, because you don't get that face-to-face interaction. You don't see each other when you're using this one. But it is very, very useful when it comes to very quickly ranking things. So maybe instead of doing like a risk poker session in a team, you can quickly do a stack ranking. That's another way it can become highly collaborative and can be easier to do online. So there's a lot of variations you can do with that one, but I feel it is slightly less collaborative because generally you do tend to do it through a poll. Nightmare headline game, not very suited for online use. I mean, you can do a virtual workshop about this. I would prefer to do it face-to-face, but it can be done. Risk poker is very easy to use virtually as well as face-to-face. It is more collaborative as well because you do it every iteration, so you get more familiar with pokering your cards every single sprint. Threat modeling, do this one face-to-face. It's not an exercise you're going to do continuously or every day. So take the time and effort to make that map of your application, to talk about risk mitigation, to talk about the threats that you need to do some security testing for as well. I also highly recommend getting in on those if as a tester you're not part of the risk part of the threat modeling sessions. It is so very useful to have a testing perspective there because there are more and more tools and tricks and tips available to mitigate those risks that come from the tester expertise. Like I said, would you risk it? Not technically really a product risk assessment type, but I feel it's best done face-to-face. The cards are not virtual. It's really hard to do online. It is very collaborative, though. It helps start the team brainstorming what the test items could be. And then last but not least is the classical product risk assessment. Now, it can be done online. I just wouldn't recommend it. You see, there's when you're talking about consensus building and really understanding the test items, and because it is an infrequent thing to do, I would recommend trying to get people together face to face. Very often it's done once at the start of a project. I mean, I don't recommend that, but that is the truth of it. So at least get the most value out of that session. For all of these, it's the same thing. Face to face, you can read people's emotion. It's something that goes away when we become virtual. It can be done, it just makes it a heck of a lot harder. So when you're having discussions about ranking risk and about understanding what the risk is about and what we're going to do about them, it's really nice to be in the same room. And it does create some of the team feeling as well that we're always after. I mean, all of them do that in effect because they are collaborative. All right. You might have noticed something. They're all basically the same set of steps, aren't they? We identify the hazards or the test items. We decide who might be harmed and how. So risk, impact, or what quality attributes are impacted. You evaluate those risks. You sort them somehow. You rank them. You create one thing that is a number one thing that is a 10, or you put something in the highest risk category and something else in the lowest risk category. And then you create a plan. You create a plan and actions to prevent them. And remember the ranking of the best things to do about risk. So avoiding risk is best. Testing is a risk mitigation. That will be second. Transfer risk if you can. And finally, and least good for business value, is to accept risk. Then record that plan. Do put it down somewhere. So per product risk item, just note down what the steps will be to mitigate those risks. Track those throughout your project, especially you test manager, test coordinator, or other orchestrator type roles out there. Keep track of this list as the project progresses to make sure that you're still covering the most important risks first. Also, don't be surprised if you need to loop back to number one when a lot of things change in your project. We, of course, work agile, so we expect change, which does mean reassessing risk frequently as well. So there's that. So yeah, they're basically the same steps, which means it's also quite possible to create variations of all the things I've said today. Please don't think that this list of 7 is the only way to think about risk in your product. There are many variants, some of which I also list in the resources that I'll be sharing with you in a minute. And also feel free to create your own variations. As long as you have these steps in there and you do them with your team, with the right stakeholders, you're going to get a nice result that at least creates a shared understanding about the product. You might later learn more. That means you have to reassess, but at least it's a starting point to think about what to test best, what to test first, and why. And it's easy to explain as well. So keep that in mind and do create your own variants of this. And if you do, please blog about it and send me a link because I love to gather these resources. So just one quick note on ideation. In this presentation, say for the Would You Risk It cards, I kind of skip over this step 1 or the step -1, this identification of hazards. Now, ideation, thinking about the product, creating a picture of it, creating a list of test items or features to test or quality attributes, whichever method you're using, there's different names for them. Creating the list is a very intensive task, and that's not ever done in like the 3 to 4 hours that these workshops take. Generally, this ideation phase is where we as testers really get to shine. We are used to thinking in this way. We use our expertise to create these lists. We talk to people, we interview them, we look at documentation, and this shortened list of about 10 items, a little more, a little less, is ideally something that is also produced a lot from your own knowledge and experience as a testing expert. And please don't think that that is done in just a couple of days. This is typically the work of a couple of weeks. So ideation, thinking about what to test, what the risks are, is a massive step, and it's generally left out of these workshop type things. It can be included, but don't be surprised if a product risk assessment breaks down on this step, where you have to restart the discussion of what's on the list and why. Because all you're doing in the other steps is ranking them and creating a plan. Very valuable to build consensus, but creating the list is also a massive step in this process, and don't skip out on that learning. Congratulations! You now know 7 ways to assess product risk. Well done, and you're still here. That's another excellent thing. Thank you for your attention, and I have one last bit of work for you to do. So hopefully you've created your list in that first step. Those 7, do you know them? Do you use them? Do you like them? So here's another bit for you to add to that. Add to that, do I want to learn this method? I've given you an overview of these 7 things. So for each one of them, it could be you want to deep dive into them a bit more. It could be that you want to create a variant of your own. Just add a little star or just a little exclamation mark if you're using a virtual version. Which one of these 7, product risk assessment, risk storming, stack ranking, nightmare headline game, threat modeling, risk poker, would you risk it? Which one of these 7 do you want to know more about? So take a minute and just mark your favorite there. So now you know which one you'd like to learn more about. And that being your key takeaway of today, you're going to love this next one. Here's all the resources for this presentation. There's some examples in there, there's some variants in there, and there's certainly enough to get you started reading or on the first steps towards these methods. It is very much a case of experience also creating the most understanding. So if you can find a way through, for instance, conferences like InflectraCON to practice these through workshops, attend one, see one, learn one, I highly recommend it. It's a great tool to have in your tool belt as a tester, and it really helps to shape the thinking within teams about what to test, when to test it, and what to test best. So here's all the resources, and I hope that in the next iteration, maybe I add your description of what you've done and add more product risk assessments to my tool belt. I'm very curious to know. And please do contact me. If you do want to send those to me, you can send them to @simplysanne on all the socials you pick, Mastodon, LinkedIn, Twitter, you'll find me. And I'm looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you for your attention. I'm very grateful to InflectraCON for having me, and I hope you enjoyed this bonus session at InflectraCON 2023.
Thanks for joining us for this virtual bonus session. We hope you enjoyed it. Learn more about InflectraCON, our live, in-person conference from April 19th through the 21st, 2023 in Washington, D.C. by visiting InflectraCON.com. Stay tuned for more great content, news, and events from Inflectra. Learn more at inflectra.com/company.